A German prisoner steps into the camp's recreation hall. He expects barbed wire, harsh guards, perhaps hunger. Instead, he hears the soft laughter of American women serving food at long wooden tables. The smell of grilled beef floats through the air. He has been told America is weak, decadent, collapsing. Yet here, he finds women in uniform, hair tied back, carrying trays of steaming hamburgers. The moment unsettles him more than any weapon could. Before we begin, share in the comments the time and place you are listening from. Subscribe to support this channel, and together we will step back into history. They had boarded the ships under armed guard, uncertain of their future, certain only that they had lost. Across the cold Atlantic, the weeks dragged on. They had been told that America was little more than a country of jazz, crime, and chaos. Propaganda had spoken of hungry workers, of a land with neither discipline nor order. The men believed they would be starved, beaten, or at the very least held in silence behind barbed fences. Yet when the gray ships reached the ports of the United States, their eyes were met with a different world. The prisoners stepped down wooden gangways, their boots striking the planks in rhythm with thousands of others. Some wore remnants of uniforms, some carried nothing at all. Their captors guided them not with shouts, but with calm gestures. The men saw towns nearby, quiet and orderly, with white houses, trimmed gardens, and cars lined neatly along broad roads. The prisoners' silence deepened, for already the picture before them clashed with the ruins of Europe they had left behind. Buses and trains carried them inland. They gazed from windows as the American countryside rolled past, fields vast and green, barns painted red, towns alive with shops and gasoline stations. There were advertisements on billboards, bright letters promising food, fuel, or soap. The soldiers who watched them smiled, smoked cigarettes, and spoke among themselves in a language the prisoners did not yet understand. It was not the America they had been told about, not the broken land of chaos, but one that seemed confident, untouched, and strong. At last the camps came into sight. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across level ground, surrounded not by concrete walls, but by simple fences and watchtowers. The men braced themselves for hunger. Instead, they were marched to dining halls where long tables stood already set. They saw white bread stacked in baskets, steaming bowls of potatoes, meat served in generous portions, and coffee poured into tin mugs. The scent alone overwhelmed them. Many had expected the diet of thin soup and stale bread that marked captivity in Europe. Here in the land of the enemy, there was abundance. Daily life began in a rhythm almost familiar. Reveille in the morning, work details in the fields or in workshops, meals on time, and evenings free for letters, games, or quiet reading. Inspections were firm but not cruel. Guards rarely raised their voices. And at night, when the lamps glowed within the barracks, the men spoke in low tones about the contradictions pressing on their minds. Could this truly be the same America they had been taught to despise? Yet among all the surprises, none were so unsettling as the presence of women. It was not every day, not in every camp, but often enough that the men felt it. Sometimes they were nurses in white, walking with calm steps through the infirmary. Sometimes clerks, their hair pinned neatly as they carried papers through the command offices. At times they came with the Red Cross, speaking softly, handing out books, cigarettes, or small comforts. The prisoners found themselves pausing mid-task when women appeared, unsure whether to look directly or to turn away. For many, the last years had been stripped of such ordinary encounters. One evening, in a camp in the South, the men heard laughter drifting across the compound. It was a light sound, foreign in that place of dust and wooden fences. They turned their heads and saw a small group of American women serving food in the recreation hall, carrying trays as though they belonged to a festival rather than a prison. The sound carried long after the hall was closed, a reminder that the world outside the wire moved with a different rhythm. At night, lying on their bunks, the men tried to place this sound in their memory. They spoke of their homes, of sisters, of wives left far away. They compared what they saw here with the rigid boundaries of their lives in Germany, where women were confined to family roles or symbolic functions. The image of American women, confident, public, at ease in uniform, unsettled them almost more than the taste of food. They had been taught that the enemy was weak, that such freedoms were signs of decay. Yet here, those freedoms were carried lightly as though strength grew from them. The camp routine deepened this impression. Work details brought them into towns, under guard, but among ordinary Americans. They saw women behind shop counters, driving cars, walking to offices, or filling gasoline at stations. Each sight pressed against their old beliefs. The guards, watching them quietly, sometimes explained in fragments of German or English that this was simply how things were. The prisoners could only nod, though confusion remained in their eyes. Letters home revealed the struggle of words. Some men wrote of humane treatment, but avoided describing the women, uncertain how such accounts would be received. Others confessed astonishment, writing that the enemy lived in plenty and allowed women to move freely, to laugh even in times of war. These words, censored or delayed, carried across the ocean into a Europe still locked in hardship and scarcity. For now, within the barbed boundaries, the men lived with a growing sense of contradiction. The barracks were plain, but clean. The guards were firm, but calm. The food was filling. And in the distance, from time to time, came the sound of women's laughter, carried by the evening air, fading slowly into the quiet of night. The laughter lingered long after the women had gone, thin and distant, like a ribbon of sound floating across the wire and into the dim-lit barracks. Some men closed their eyes and let it drift over them, imagining home, imagining voices from streets they once knew. Others turned their faces to the wall, unsettled by what such laughter meant. It was not harsh, not mocking, not a sound of victory. It was light and ordinary, woven into the rhythm of a camp where they expected only punishment. That very ordinariness gave it power. For many prisoners, the memory of women had become blurred with absence. Years of war had thinned the presence of mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters into letters and photographs. In the regimented world they had left, interactions with women were marked by constraint and by expectation. Here, across an ocean, the roles were different. The women they saw in camp offices or serving lines did not behave as fragile symbols. They moved with self-assurance, their steps unhurried, their voices clear. To German eyes trained on rigidity, this confidence unsettled the ground beneath them. The guards themselves seemed to treat these women as equals, greeting them with familiarity, joking without concern. In the dim barracks, men whispered of the strange equality, unsure whether it was weakness or strength. They compared it to the world they had left, where propaganda had painted women as keepers of the hearth, silent supporters of men's duty, never visible in public spheres of authority. And yet, in America, women appeared in the very center of things, even within the boundaries of prison. The Red Cross made this presence more visible. With regular visits came parcels, letters, and checks on camp conditions. Women often accompanied these teams, taking notes or offering supplies. They smiled without fear, asked questions, handed out items with steady composure. To the men, these visits were a reminder that their treatment was not left only to guards and officers, but was watched and recorded by a wider world. The simple fact that women played this role sharpened the contrast further. Daily camp life settled into an unexpected routine. Work assignments carried prisoners into fields, forests, or canning factories, always under watch, but never with the cruelty many had expected. At midday, meals were served that dwarfed the rations of war-torn Europe. Loaves of bread, steaming meat, vegetables in quantities that startled even the most stoic. Yet it was in the evenings, when the day's tasks were done, that the prisoners felt the strangeness most strongly. Through open windows or across recreation halls came the faint hum of conversations in English, women's voices mixing with men's, a normality the prisoners had been told could not exist. The contrast pressed into memory when they read their own newspapers, smuggled or provided under supervision. German propaganda still insisted that America was corrupt, disorganized, unable to sustain its people, but the evidence around them contradicted these words at every turn. The prisoners began to speak more openly among themselves, not yet to abandon belief, but to ask quiet questions. Could it be that the enemy had strength not in spite of, but because of, these freedoms? Food became the most persistent reminder. The smell of it seeped through wooden walls, rising from kitchens into barracks, settling into clothes and hair. One prisoner wrote later that he could not escape the aroma of roasted meat, so constant and rich that it haunted his sleep. They had been told America was a land of unemployment, of breadlines, of hunger. Instead, the meals themselves became a form of education. The abundance was reinforced by Red Cross parcels, sometimes shared, sometimes hoarded. Cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee appeared with such regularity that men compared it bitterly to the shortages faced at home. Some grew resentful, feeling guilt that they ate better as prisoners than their families as civilians. Others surrendered to the comfort, letting the warmth of meals soften the edge of defeat. Even in the plain barracks, the air carried the sense of kitchens, the faint perfume of visitors, and the ordinary smells of soap and laundry. These combined into an atmosphere not of punishment, but of dislocation, a feeling that they had been transported into a world beyond their old maps. The sound of laughter, the sight of women, the smell of food, all of these were details, yet together they began to erode the images built by years of propaganda. Still, not every man welcomed the erosion. Some clung tightly to the memory of what they had been told, repeating the words of their leaders like a shield. They insisted that what they saw was a mask, a deception, a temporary illusion. They said the women were only brought in for show, the food only provided while eyes watched. Yet as days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, such claims grew harder to hold. The ordinary continued without pause. At night, long after lights were dimmed, whispers carried across bunks. The men spoke of their astonishment, their confusion. They described the scent of beef, the sound of laughter, the sight of women walking without fear among armed guards. They spoke of home, of what their families might say if they could see the enemy in this way. Silence often followed these conversations, silence filled with questions left unanswered. And in that silence, faint but unyielding, the smell of food drifted through the walls once more, carrying with it not only comfort but disquiet. The smell was what lingered most. Even when the barracks grew silent and the men had pulled their blankets over their shoulders, the air seemed heavy with it, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the fragrance of roasted beef and fresh bread. Some tried to ignore it, willing their minds back to the rye fields and stews of home, but the aroma of something distinctly American slipped through memory and pulled them back to the present. It was not the smell of boiled potatoes or dark bread, nor the sharp tang of cabbage that many had grown used to. It was something warmer, heavier, almost celebratory, as if a festival were taking place just beyond the wire. One evening, when the men shuffled into the dining hall, they saw what the smell had promised. Laid before them were trays not of soup and thin slices of bread, but of small round sandwiches wrapped in paper, steaming as though they had been rushed straight from the kitchen. The guards referred to them casually as hamburgers. To the prisoners, the sight was bewildering. They had been told of hamburgers as a sort of curiosity, an American oddity. Few had ever seen one. None had expected to encounter them here in a prison camp, half a world away. The first bites came hesitantly. A prisoner lifted the bread with both hands, inspecting the patty of meat pressed between the halves. Some sniffed at the mixture of onion and mustard. Others frowned at the glisten of grease. Yet hunger overcame hesitation. Teeth sank into soft bread and juicy beef, the warmth filling mouths with flavors unfamiliar. Salt, fat, and smoke mingled together. Some chewed in silence. Others raised their eyebrows in surprise. The meal was not refined, not the kind of cooking that belonged to a table set with knives and wine, but it was filling, quick, and oddly satisfying. Later, the guards would explain that hamburgers were nothing special in America. They were ordinary food, served in countless diners, drive-ins, and new restaurants that had begun to multiply even in wartime. Some mentioned a place called McDonald's, still small then, just a few outlets on the western side of the country, but already a symbol of speed and efficiency. The idea that food could be made in such abundance, served in minutes, and still taste fresh, left the prisoners unsettled. The abundance of hamburgers in a prison camp spoke of something larger. Behind it lay the strength of American agriculture, factories, and distribution systems. Even with millions of soldiers overseas, even with war-consuming resources, the nation could feed its captives with meat and bread more generously than many nations fed their own citizens. To prisoners who had grown used to shortages, to long lines for rationed goods, the simple burger became a reminder of America's hidden might. Letters home carried descriptions of these meals, though often softened or left vague. Some feared that to write openly of hamburgers would cause anger or disbelief among families struggling for scraps. Still, the words appeared in fragments: meat in abundance, bread soft and white, flavors strange but plentiful. For some, the act of writing about such food felt like betrayal. For others, it was proof that propaganda had failed. The experience of hamburgers also revealed the cultural distance between the two worlds. In Germany, meals were bound by tradition, slow and structured. Here in America, food seemed industrial, made for speed, designed to feed many at once. Yet the very efficiency astonished the prisoners. They began to whisper that if America could produce such abundance for its enemies, what must it be giving to its own people, to its soldiers at the front? Not all accepted it without resistance. Some muttered that it was a trick, that the hamburgers were meant to weaken their resolve by tempting them with comfort. Others insisted it was unsustainable, that soon the camps would run dry. Yet week after week, the meals continued: burgers and bread, potatoes and coffee, always enough for all. The illusion, if it was one, did not break. The food brought new rhythms to camp life. Men began to look forward to mealtimes, not only for the nourishment, but for the strange familiarity it offered. Some adapted quickly, tearing into burgers with appetite, licking grease from their fingers. Others ate slowly, as if to memorize the taste for the uncertain future. In the evenings, they compared notes, debating whether such meals were signs of decadence or of strength. At night, after the trays were cleared and the hall stood silent again, the smell clung to the air. Prisoners lay awake, recalling the bite of salt, the softness of bread, the warmth of meat that filled their stomachs. For some, it was a comfort, proof that they would not starve. For others, it was disquieting, evidence that everything they had believed about the enemy was untrue. And always the image remained: a prisoner staring at a simple hamburger, holding it in his hands as if it were more than food, as if it were a message carried across the ocean, wrapped not in paper but in power. The prisoner held the sandwich in his hands for a long moment before biting. The warmth of the bun pressed against his palms, the scent of cooked meat rising in steady waves. He had been taught that the enemy would starve him, that he would be reduced to thin broth and scraps of bread. Yet here he sat with a meal that looked as if it had come from a festival booth rather than a prison camp kitchen. Around him, other men stared at their portions, uncertain whether to trust what lay before them. Then, almost reluctantly, teeth sank into bread and beef, and the hall filled with the sound of chewing. The first taste startled him. Grease coated his tongue, salt pricked his lips, and the meat, juicier than the lean cuts he had known at home, seemed to collapse easily under the bite. The mustard stung faintly at the nose, while onions crackled with sharpness. It was messy, crude, and strangely filling. He chewed slowly, feeling the strangeness of a flavor designed for swiftness rather than refinement. It was not the food of his mother's kitchen, nor the stews of the barracks in Europe. It was something different, something that spoke of machines and mass production, of fields that stretched far beyond what his eyes could imagine. Whispers rose along the tables. Some men laughed quietly, as if embarrassed by the pleasure the food gave them. Others frowned, chewing with suspicion, as though expecting the taste to sour. One muttered that it was no more than a peasant's meal, simple and coarse. Another countered that such coarseness, when multiplied thousands of times, was a sign of wealth greater than delicacy. For what did it mean if a nation could serve its prisoners, in the midst of war, meat enough to satisfy? In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of meals became a lesson in itself. Hamburgers were not served every day, but often enough that they became familiar. Potatoes, bread, and coffee filled the spaces between, yet the memory of those round buns lingered. It was not simply the flavor, but the abundance. In Europe, meat had become scarce, bread coarse, coffee stretched thin with substitutes. Here, even in a prison camp, there was no such lack. Behind every meal lay the machinery of America's agricultural system. The prisoners did not see the fields of wheat harvested by combines, the cattle driven to slaughterhouses, or the trucks that carried food across highways, but they felt the presence of that machinery in the regularity of meals, in the certainty that tomorrow would bring another tray of food. They spoke of it at night, wondering how a country could fight a war across oceans and still feed both its army and its captives. The conclusion pressed on them like a weight. America was not weak. America was vast. This abundance stood in sharp contrast to the scarcity of their memories. Some recalled their last days at home, when rations had shrunk and families tightened belts. Others remembered long marches on the Eastern Front, sustained only by thin broth and hard bread. To eat well in captivity while their countrymen suffered stirred unease, guilt mixed with gratitude, bitterness with relief. They wrote cautiously in letters, unsure whether to tell the truth, afraid that their words might wound those who waited across the sea. At night, after the lamps were dimmed, the camp lay under a silence broken only by shifting blankets and distant guard steps. Yet even in silence, the meals returned to memory. A man would close his eyes and feel again the soft bread in his hands, the grease on his lips, the heaviness in his stomach that came not from deprivation, but from fullness. It was a fullness that carried a kind of danger, for it threatened to soften resolve, to erode the edge of defiance. The men began to notice more than food. The abundance at the table seemed to echo in other parts of camp life. The guards carried cigarettes easily, smoked without rationing. Newspapers arrived, printed daily, filled with images and stories of a country that appeared untouched by war. Radios crackled with music, cheerful and quick, filling the air with rhythms unlike the marches of Europe. Even the clothing of civilians glimpsed during work details looked whole, without patches, without signs of want. In their minds, the taste of a hamburger became tied to these sights and sounds. It was not merely a sandwich. It was the symbol of a country where production seemed endless, where war had not drained the shelves bare. Each bite was a reminder of a strength they had not been prepared to face. And so, even as they licked the last traces of mustard from their fingers, a quiet unease lingered. One evening, as the camp grew still, a man sat on his bunk staring at his hands. He could feel again the warmth of the bun, the press of meat against bread, the salt on his tongue. Outside, the crickets sang in the dark, and the towers glowed faintly against the horizon. Around him, murmurs rose from other bunks, men whispering their disbelief, their astonishment, their guilt. Then the room fell silent once more. Through that silence came a different sound, the faint rustle of newspapers, pages turning under lantern light, carrying photographs and stories of American life. And with those pages came the realization that the hamburgers were only part of a larger abundance, a single flavor in a feast of prosperity that stretched far beyond the fences. In the dark barracks, the murmurs rose like threads of smoke, faint but insistent, carried from one bunk to another. Men whispered to themselves and to each other, the same question repeated with small variations, as if turning it over might reveal an answer hidden within. Is this really the enemy? Could it be that the nation they had been told was weak and collapsing was in truth strong enough to feed them, strong enough to place women in positions of confidence, strong enough to produce abundance even for captives? The silence that followed such questions was heavier than the words themselves, for no one wished to admit too quickly what the answers implied. The propaganda that had shaped them had been relentless. America, they were told, was decadent, disorganized, ruled by the whims of financiers and criminals, held together only by illusions. Its people were lazy, distracted by entertainment, unable to endure sacrifice. Such images had been etched into their minds by films, by leaflets, by speeches. Yet here, In the routine of captivity, they encountered order rather than chaos, abundance rather than scarcity, and laughter rather than despair. Each meal, each sound of women's voices, each glimpse of daily American life pushed against the walls of belief built over years. For some, the dissonance was too great, and they clung harder to the stories they had carried across the ocean. They insisted that all of this was staged, that the food was temporary, that the women were placed in their sight as part of a performance meant to deceive. They said that beyond the camp fences, America was rotting, that the smiles of the guards were masks. These men repeated the words like a litany, as if by saying them often enough, they could make them true. But the litany wore thin when the same abundance appeared day after day, when the same women arrived without fear, when newspapers and radios carried stories of industries producing without pause. Others surrendered more quickly to the evidence of their senses. They admitted in low voices that they had been misled, that the propaganda had been smoke rather than stone. For them, the shock was both liberating and unsettling, for it forced them to consider what else might be false. If America was not as weak as they had been told, what of the other stories they had believed? Letters became vessels for these contradictions. Some prisoners avoided describing their conditions in detail, afraid that to speak openly of full plates and soft bread would wound families suffering shortages at home. Others hinted cautiously, saying only that they were treated better than expected, leaving the truth to be imagined between the lines. A few dared to write plainly, reporting that they ate meat more often than civilians in Germany, that they were offered cigarettes, that women appeared in their daily lives as if the war had not erased normality here. Censors sometimes cut such words, yet fragments slipped through small cracks in the wall of illusion. Conversations with guards deepened the confusion. One day, as a prisoner hesitated over a hamburger, a guard shrugged and said in broken German, "It is ordinary food, nothing special." The simplicity of the remark struck harder than a speech could. If such meals were ordinary, then what was extraordinary? If this was only the baseline of American life, then the true heights of prosperity lay beyond imagination. The men turned the comment over in their minds, repeating it to one another, unable to shake its quiet weight. In the evenings, as the barracks dimmed and only the glow of lanterns remained, discussions stretched late into the night. Some spoke with awe of what they had seen, others with suspicion. A few began to ask questions aloud that others held silently. If America was capable of such abundance, why had their leaders described it as a nation on the edge of collapse? What purpose had such lies served, and what had those lies cost them now? The questions drifted into silence, unanswered, unresolved, yet never disappearing. These moments did not erase loyalty overnight, nor did they transform every prisoner into a believer in America's virtues. Belief is not shed so easily, yet doubt had entered, and once inside, it could not be forced out. Doubt grew in the spaces between meals, in the quiet moments when a man turned the pages of an English magazine or watched a nurse carry supplies through the compound. It grew in the silence after a guard's casual remark, in the sound of women laughing beyond the wire, in the taste of food that contradicted every image of enemy cruelty. One prisoner later recalled lying awake after such a day, staring at the ceiling boards, hearing the creak of bunks around him. He felt the weight of bread still heavy in his stomach, smelled the faint trace of meat on his fingers, and could not escape the question that repeated itself in his mind. If the enemy had been painted in lies, then what else in his world had been built on falsehoods? Outside, the camp lay still. The watchtowers hummed with faint electric light, and the night wind carried the smell of cut grass from nearby fields. The men listened to the silence, broken only by the soft turning of pages as one of them unfolded a magazine left behind after dinner. The rustle of paper seemed louder than it should have been, each page filled with images of another life. And as the pictures passed beneath the lantern glow, they revealed something even more startling than food or laughter. The sight of women in factories, in offices, in places of public life that no one in the barracks had ever imagined. The rustle of the pages was steady, each sheet turned with care, as though the man feared the images might vanish if he moved too quickly. The lantern's glow fell across photographs of women in overalls, women gripping tools, women standing beside machines that seemed as large as houses. The prisoners leaned closer, drawn by the strangeness of it. Here were not the soft, idealized figures they had been shown in posters at home, not the mothers framed by hearth and cradle, but women in the heart of industry, sleeves rolled, eyes set on tasks of weight and precision. The magazine spoke without needing words. In America, women worked where men once stood, and the nation did not collapse. The men whispered among themselves, some scoffing, others silent. They tried to imagine their own sisters or wives in such settings. The picture felt both alien and threatening, for it upended the order they had believed immutable. In Germany, propaganda had insisted that women were anchors of the home, symbols of fertility and family, supporters of men's strength, but never equal in labor or authority. Yet these photographs showed a different truth. Women handling welding torches, operating lathes, producing airplanes and ships in numbers beyond comprehension. The guards, hearing their puzzled questions, explained in fragments of German and English that this was normal, that while men fought overseas, women filled the factories, ensuring that production never faltered. The idea was difficult to grasp. Factories staffed by women, ships launched by their hands, munitions built by their labor. Such images seemed the stuff of fantasy. And yet, here was proof printed in ink, carried casually in a magazine left on a table, as ordinary in America as bread on the tray. The photographs unsettled more than pride. They hinted at the secret of American abundance. If women could step into such roles without the nation collapsing, then the labor force was doubled, the productivity multiplied. Machines, already vast in scale, became greater still when operated by countless new hands. This, the men realized slowly, was part of why the camp kitchens never faltered, why trucks delivered goods in endless streams, why hamburgers appeared on trays without pause. The strength of America was not only in its fields and factories, but in its willingness to use all of its people. Night after night, the magazines circulated. They contained more than images of industry. There were pictures of women playing sports, women driving cars, women working as journalists, teachers, clerks. Each page seemed to contradict something the prisoners had carried in their minds. Some pages showed advertisements, glamorous and strange, of smiling women selling soap or cigarettes, suggesting not scarcity, but plenty, not despair, but leisure. The men stared, their expressions caught between disbelief and longing. During the day, work details confirmed the pages. Prisoners taken into nearby towns under guard glimpsed women behind counters, ringing up purchases, chatting with customers. They saw women walking to offices with briefcases, guiding children, driving cars with confidence. Each sight pressed deeper, the same question: how could this be the land of weakness and decay? At times, the Red Cross visitors deepened the impression. Women in uniform arrived to distribute supplies, their presence calm and professional. They asked questions, wrote notes, smiled as they moved among prisoners and guards alike. The men followed them with their eyes, torn between respect and discomfort. For some, the encounter was too disorienting, a blow against a worldview shaped by rigid gender roles. For others, it opened a door to possibility, though a possibility they did not yet dare name aloud. It was not only gender that unsettled them. Alongside the images of women came photographs of factories themselves, cavernous spaces filled with assembly lines stretching beyond sight. Tanks rolled out in neat columns, airplanes filled entire hangars, ships were launched one after another from crowded docks. To men who had known shortages, who had seen production in their homeland strained to breaking, these pictures revealed an industrial strength almost beyond imagination. If hamburgers were a taste of America's abundance, these photographs were its map, the blueprint of power drawn in steel and smoke. The men spoke of it at night, voices hushed, as if fearing that to say too much would summon punishment. They wondered aloud how their leaders could have underestimated such a nation. They asked if the war had ever been winnable against a land that could produce both weapons and comforts in such quantity. Some answered with defiance, insisting that Germany's spirit outweighed material power. But even as they said it, their eyes betrayed doubt, for the evidence pressed on them daily. In the barracks, the sound of turning pages grew as familiar as the sound of guards' footsteps outside. Each sheet carried a fragment of a world that challenged their beliefs. Sometimes the men would gather around a single magazine, passing it hand to hand, pointing at images, debating in low tones. Other times, an individual would sit alone, staring at a page until the lantern burned low, lost in thought. And then there were the subtler images, the advertisements that showed American families in kitchens filled with appliances, cars gleaming in driveways, tables covered with food. To men whose families faced rationing and scarcity, these pictures were as shocking as photographs of factories. They spoke of a land where comfort was not reserved for the few, but available even to the many. They suggested a society not on the verge of collapse, but expanding, confident, secure enough to feed its enemies, and still enjoy plenty. The combination of food, images, and encounters created a spiral of unease. Each detail taken alone might have been dismissed as a trick. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The hamburgers on the tray, the laughter of women across the hall, the photographs of factories, the magazines left casually behind. All these threads wove into a tapestry that contradicted everything they had believed. Late one evening, after the guards had extinguished the lamps, a prisoner lay awake listening to the soft breathing around him. He thought of the magazine pages, of women smiling from factory floors, of machines rolling out in endless streams. He thought of the meals that filled his stomach, the voices that carried across the camp yard, the scent of perfume that sometimes lingered faintly when Red Cross visitors passed. And as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, he realized that the very air of the camp had changed. It no longer smelled only of wood and dust. It carried traces of kitchens, of ink and paper, of soap and perfume, of lives lived beyond his reach, yet close enough to disturb his dreams. That faint trace of perfume, carried once through a guardhouse window, lingered in his mind as he closed his eyes, a reminder that the boundaries of his world were shifting in ways he could neither fully resist nor fully accept. The faint trace of perfume lingered like a ghost, caught in the wooden frames of the barracks, and carried into memory long after the visitor had gone. It was not strong, not the thick fragrance of luxury, but something lighter, a scent that suggested cleanliness, fabric pressed smooth, a life lived beyond hardship. For the men lying awake in their bunks, that trace became a quiet disturbance, a reminder that the enemy they had imagined faceless and cruel was instead capable of such ordinary human presence. It was a reminder carried not by rifles or orders, but by the movement of a woman through the narrow paths of a prison camp. When women arrived in the compound, whether as nurses, clerks, or Red Cross representatives, the air seemed to shift. Guards spoke to them in tones different from the ones they used with prisoners, casual, respectful, sometimes even playful. The women carried themselves without fear, without hesitation, as if their presence in such spaces were a matter of course. For German eyes trained to see women in the background of public life, these moments unsettled. They revealed a society where women did not vanish into silence during war, but stepped into roles that placed them side by side with men, even before rows of defeated enemies. Some prisoners reacted with awkwardness, turning their eyes away, unwilling to meet the gaze of a woman who asked a question or offered a parcel. Others stared too long, drawn not only by curiosity, but by a sense of disorientation. For years, women had been framed in their world as symbols, either of family purity or of danger, never as co-workers or officials. Yet here were women speaking calmly, writing notes, checking lists, offering cigarettes, as though such gestures required no explanation. The magazines had already prepared their minds with photographs of women in factories, but photographs were still at a distance. To see and hear women moving freely within the wire, to smell their perfume mingled with the dust of the compound, made the contradiction sharper. It was no longer only theory, it was lived experience. In the evenings after such visits, the barracks grew restless. Men whispered about what they had seen. Some spoke with admiration, even envy, marveling at the confidence and presence of American women. Others scoffed, dismissing them as unfeminine, claiming such a society would crumble under the weight of disorder. But the scoffing often faded into silence, for the evidence of order remained all around them. Food served on time, work organized, guards calm, supplies delivered without fail. Even during work details outside the camp, the presence of women in American life continued to press on their perceptions. They saw women guiding trucks, handing out mail, standing behind desks in post offices, ringing up purchases in shops. They saw women with children, women without, women walking to factories as shifts began or ended. Each sight chipped at the idea that America was weak, that its people were disorganized, that its women were confined. Some prisoners began to discuss quietly what such a world might mean. Could a nation grow stronger by allowing women to work, to appear in public, to carry authority? Was this the source of the abundance that surrounded them? These were not easy questions to ask, and often they ended with shrugs, silence, or nervous laughter. But the questions themselves marked a change. Letters again revealed the struggle. Few dared to mention the presence of women directly, fearing both censors and misunderstanding at home, but traces slipped through. A man might write that visitors had come to the camp and carried themselves with assurance, or that the people here lived in ways unfamiliar. Families reading between the lines sometimes sensed more than was written. One story spread quietly from camp to camp of a German officer who had once lectured his men on the weakness of America, only to stand dumbfounded when a young American woman, clipboard in hand, entered the compound to record supplies. The officer, it was said, had faltered mid-sentence, unable to continue, as though the sight itself were an argument against his words. Whether true or not, the tale carried a symbolic weight, repeated in whispers as evidence that propaganda could collapse in a single moment. For many prisoners, the presence of women became entwined with a larger recognition that America's strength was not only industrial, but social. Its ability to bring all citizens into the work of war, men and women alike, allowed it to fight on distant continents while still projecting abundance at home. This realization crept slowly, almost unwillingly, into their thoughts. Some resisted it, holding tightly to the belief that disorder must lurk beneath the surface. Others accepted it with quiet resignation, as though acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. At night, when the camp fell into silence, the faint trace of perfume returned in memory, mixing with the smells of soap, coffee, and wood. It became a symbol of something larger, an invisible thread connecting the prisoners to a world beyond their understanding. A reminder that the enemy they had imagined faceless and cruel was instead complex, filled with ordinary details that could not be dismissed. And as they drifted into uneasy sleep, the last image that lingered was of women walking across the compound at sunset, their silhouettes framed against the fading light, their voices carrying just enough to unsettle dreams. The silhouettes lingered long after sunset, etched into memory by the fading glow of the horizon. The women had walked calmly toward the gate, their voices a gentle murmur against the dusk, their movements unhurried, as though even the setting of the sun acknowledged their place in this world. Inside the barracks, the men remained restless, their thoughts unsettled. Some closed their eyes only to see the shapes of those figures against the light. Others turned their faces to the wall, trying to push away the unease stirred within them. Yet the images clung, persistent as shadows. They had been raised in a system that told them where men belonged and where women did not. The lines were drawn clearly, spoken in classrooms, shouted from podiums, repeated in posters. Women were to guard the home, to raise children, to embody purity and continuity. They were not to step into the spaces of labor, power, or authority, except as symbols. To see otherwise was to see disorder. And yet here, in the heart of captivity, they had seen otherwise every day. The women who worked in American offices, who served in Red Cross uniforms, who walked through the compound with quiet authority, these were not symbols but participants, woven into the fabric of a nation at war. The men spoke of it in cautious tones. Some insisted it was unnatural that such freedom for women would lead to collapse. They repeated the words they had been taught. A nation cannot stand when it blurs the order between man and woman, yet the evidence pressed against their arguments. If America was collapsing, why did the camps remain supplied? Why did the trucks arrive on time? Why did the factories produce endlessly? Why did meals appear in abundance, even for prisoners? Each argument faltered against the persistence of what they saw and tasted daily. Others wondered more quietly whether they had been taught wrongly. Perhaps, they said, strength could be found not in separation, but in cooperation. Perhaps America's abundance was not despite its women, but because of them. Such thoughts were dangerous to voice too loudly, for they seemed to betray the beliefs that had once bound them. But in the safety of darkness, whispered between bunks, the questions grew. The presence of women did not merely unsettle ideology, it stirred memories too. Men spoke of sisters who had been sent to farms, of wives who struggled with ration cards, of mothers left in bombed-out streets. They imagined what those women might do if given the same freedom as the women here. Could they have stepped into factories, into offices, into the roles that filled magazines and American towns? The thought was bittersweet, for it suggested both possibility and loss. The guards rarely commented on these matters, but their behavior offered lessons of its own. They spoke with women as equals, not deferential, not dismissive, simply accustomed. For the prisoners watching from within the fences, this casual equality was perhaps more disorienting than any lecture. It showed that the American way of life was not a performance for their benefit, but a habit practiced daily without thought. At dusk, when work details returned from fields or mills, the sight of women walking home through nearby towns deepened the impression. Their steps were steady, their faces unguarded, their laughter rising above the hum of cars. To men who had been told that war stripped societies bare, these glimpses suggested a resilience that felt unshakable. It was not only the factories or the armies that sustained America, but the quiet persistence of daily life, shared by men and women together. Some prisoners tried to dismiss it as illusion. They said that appearances were deceiving, that hidden beneath the surface lay weakness. But with each passing week, the illusion refused to shatter. Supplies did not fail. Work continued. Women reappeared in offices, in Red Cross visits, in photographs and advertisements. The persistence of their presence made denial harder. At night, the camp air carried the weight of these contradictions. Men lay awake, their minds filled with images of women walking away at sunset, leaving them restless in their bunks. Dreams mingled uneasily with memories, mixing the voices of propaganda with the laughter that had drifted across the fences. The boundaries between belief and observation blurred. One prisoner wrote later that the hardest part of captivity was not the fences or the guards, but the slow erosion of certainty. He had been sure of what was true when he entered the camp. He left unsure of almost everything. The laughter of women, the smell of hamburgers, the photographs of factories, all these details seemed small, yet together they worked like drops of water wearing away stone. The unease carried into the following days. Men spoke less of certain victory, less of superiority. They spoke instead of confusion of questions left unanswered. The more thoughtful among them realized that war was not only fought with weapons, but with the power of ordinary life. To see women walk calmly through the compound at sunset was to see a victory of another kind, one not measured in battles won, but in beliefs undone. The memory of those silhouettes did not fade with the night. Even as the camp quieted, the image remained unresolved, stirring in the darkness. And when morning came, the prisoners awoke not to silence, but to a new sound rising faintly from the recreation hall. The crackle of a radio, carrying music that none of them had ever heard before, a rhythm both strange and insistent, filling the air with unfamiliar energy. The radio crackled as if reluctant to release its sounds, a hesitant burst of static before a rhythm slipped into the air. It was unlike the marches that had carried them across Europe, unlike the solemn hymns of their parades. This was looser, restless, filled with syncopation that seemed to trip over itself only to land again with confidence. A saxophone wailed, a trumpet answered, and drums stitched the space between them with a pulse that defied order. The prisoners sat still, caught between curiosity and unease. Some frowned, muttering that such noise was undisciplined. Others tilted their heads, listening as though trying to decipher a language in which every syllable was turned inside out. It was jazz, the guards explained casually, as though naming something ordinary. To the men inside the camp, it was anything but ordinary. They had been told that American culture was decadent, that its music was chaos without soul. Yet here, in the thin air above the recreation hall, the chaos carried an energy that seemed alive. The rhythms were strange but not weak, playful but not frivolous. Even those who disliked it could not ignore the vitality that radiated from each note. The evenings grew longer with this music. Radios played not only jazz, but popular songs, voices smooth and confident, carrying words the prisoners did not always understand, but whose tone was unmistakable. Joy, longing, humor, hope. Some men began to hum along, shaping nonsense syllables to match the rhythms. Others turned away, unwilling to let the sounds pierce their defenses. Yet the music seeped into the camp as inexorably as the smell of food or the sight of women. It became another thread in the tapestry of contradiction. Debates arose in the barracks after the radios fell silent. One man would insist that such music revealed the weakness of the enemy, the lack of discipline, the indulgence of chaos. Another would argue that strength lay precisely in this freedom, that a nation capable of producing both order and improvisation was more resilient than one bound by rigidity. The discussion stretched late into the night, unresolved, circling back again and again to the same question. What kind of people were they truly fighting? The camp authorities encouraged these debates in subtle ways. Libraries were stocked with English books and translated texts. Newspapers arrived daily, filled not only with war reports, but with columns on politics, science, art, and sport. Some camps even hosted lectures or film screenings designed not to indoctrinate, but to show prisoners slices of American life. The strategy was quiet, almost invisible, to let the reality of America contradict the illusions that propaganda had built. The men noticed. They saw that no one forced them to listen to the radio. No one demanded they read the newspapers. Yet the materials were always there, available, insistent in their ordinariness. The absence of compulsion was itself disarming. In Germany, propaganda had thundered from every loudspeaker, unavoidable. Here, in captivity, truth seemed to arrive as casually as a hamburger on a tray, a magazine left on a table, thus a song drifting from a radio. Work details into nearby towns deepened the contradictions. Guards sometimes explained the music on the air, the singers and bands whose names were foreign to the prisoners. They pointed to posters announcing concerts or dances as though to say, "This is simply our life." The men returned to camp with these images in their minds, adding them to the growing catalog of questions they could not answer. At night, the radio's echo lingered in memory. A man lying in his bunk might find his foot tapping unconsciously, his mind replaying a trumpet line or the sway of a voice. Another might scold him, insisting that such music was corruption. But the rhythm was hard to banish. It lived in the body as much as in the ear. The debates that followed were not only about music. They spread to broader questions. If America was capable of such creativity, what else might it be capable of? Could such a society, free and chaotic as it seemed, also be strong in ways they had not imagined? Did freedom itself produce abundance rather than weakness? These questions had no easy answers, but they planted seeds of doubt that grew with each passing week. The camp authorities sometimes arranged discussions more deliberately, inviting prisoners to share their views, even allowing them to write essays or engage with American lecturers. These sessions did not resemble indoctrination, but dialogue. Prisoners were surprised by the patience with which guards or teachers listened, by the absence of threats when disagreements were voiced. The freedom to argue without punishment unsettled them almost as much as the hamburgers or the presence of women. One prisoner recalled years later that the most disarming moment was when a guard handed him a newspaper and said simply, "See for yourself." That gesture, trusting him to read, to think, to compare, was more persuasive than any command. It forced him to reckon with evidence rather than slogans. Still, Not all were persuaded. Some retreated deeper into ideology, rejecting everything they saw and heard as tricks. They refused the magazines, dismissed the music, avoided discussion. Yet even for them, the doubt was harder to silence than they admitted. The sights, the smells, the sounds surrounded them daily, wearing at their certainty. One evening, as the radio played a particularly lively tune, a group of prisoners sat in silence, listening despite themselves. The rhythm grew faster, the instruments layered until the hall seemed to pulse with energy. Then, just as suddenly, the music ended, replaced by the static of silence. The men looked at each other, some smiling faintly, others frowning. No one spoke. The absence of sound felt heavier than the music itself, as if the air still carried echoes not yet willing to fade. Into that silence came a question, asked quietly from one bunk. What will we carry home when this is over? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a thread left dangling. Would they carry memories of food and laughter, or of propaganda and pride? Would they return unchanged, or would the sights and sounds of captivity reshape them in ways they could not yet see? The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the guard towers. Then, from the corner of the room, a different sound emerged, the crackle of another radio, this one faint, carrying not only music but news. Headlines spoke of battles abroad, of victories and losses, of fronts shifting. But alongside these reports came advertisements, jokes, and voices of women speaking to the public. The mixture itself was bewildering. War and leisure, destruction and life, side by side in the same broadcast. The prisoners listened, their thoughts circling back to the same disquiet. If this was ordinary, what else in America was yet unseen? The second radio continued to crackle, its thin signal threading through the quiet barracks like a voice carried on wind. The men leaned closer, straining to catch words. Between reports of battles and shifting front lines came an unexpected stream of sound, an advertisement for soap. A woman's voice, light and cheerful, promising freshness, as if the war itself were only a distant storm. Then came a burst of laughter from a comedy sketch, followed without pause by music once more, a tune bright and full of rhythm. The prisoners exchanged glances, unsettled by the juxtaposition. War, humor, commerce, and song woven into a single broadcast. Was this chaos, or was it resilience? For those who had lived under propaganda's relentless weight, the contrast was almost disorienting. In their homeland, broadcasts carried only the drumbeat of ideology, the voice of the state hammering certainty into every ear. Here, in the land of the enemy, war reports shared space with entertainment, as though ordinary life refused to be silenced. To some, this seemed weakness, a failure to treat war with solemnity. Yet others began to sense another truth, that such coexistence was a kind of strength, a refusal to let war consume everything. The men discussed it deep into the night, their words low so as not to carry beyond the bunks. One argued that such frivolity would make a people soft, unfit for the sacrifices of war. Another countered that a nation able to laugh, to sing, to sell soap while waging battles across oceans must be secure indeed. The debate swirled without resolution, each man caught between old beliefs and new evidence. Over time, the accumulation of these experiences began to reshape perception. The hamburgers served on tin trays, the magazines filled with photographs of women in factories, the confident steps of Red Cross nurses, the music of jazz, the radio's seamless blending of war and leisure, all became parts of a single puzzle. Each piece contradicted propaganda's image of a decadent, collapsing enemy. Together, they suggested a society abundant, resilient, and unwilling to surrender its daily rhythms, even in the midst of global conflict. Some prisoners resisted fiercely, clinging to ideology as if it were the last anchor of identity. They dismissed the abundance as temporary, the women as actors, the music as noise. Yet even in dismissal, their words carried doubt, for the very need to explain away the evidence revealed its weight. Others yielded more quietly, not with sudden conversion, but with slow acknowledgement. They began to admit, at least to themselves, that what they saw and heard could not be denied. The re-education programs, subtle and persistent, reinforced this shift. Lectures offered glimpses of American history, Films showed images of its landscapes. Books told stories of its politics and struggles. The prisoners were not forced to attend, but many did, drawn by curiosity as much as by the desire to fill empty hours. What they found was not the brittle certainty of propaganda, but complexity. A nation that argued with itself, that tolerated disagreement, that seemed to thrive not in spite of difference, but because of it. In the barracks, late at night, men debated what it all meant. Could freedom produce strength? Could abundance and discipline coexist? Could women's presence in factories and offices be a sign not of decline but of renewal? Each question cut against the lessons drilled into them during their service. Each question chipped away at certainty. One prisoner years later described lying awake, listening to jazz through the thin static of the radio. At first, he despised it, calling it disorder, noise without form. But slowly, over weeks, he found himself tapping his foot, then humming along until the rhythms felt natural. He realized with unease that his body had accepted what his mind still resisted. It was in such small, unnoticed moments that change began. The presence of abundance reinforced the lesson. Even as the war dragged on, the meals remained generous, the supply trucks steady, the guards unhurried. The prisoners could not ignore the evidence of a system that seemed unshaken by years of conflict. If this was weakness, then weakness was stronger than anything they had known. Letters from home sharpened the contrast. Families wrote of shortages, of bombings, of ration lines stretching down streets. Against these words, the prisoners measured their own lives. Full plates, magazines, music, the presence of women moving without fear, guilt mixed with disbelief. Some stopped writing details, afraid to deepen the wound of contrast. Others confessed quietly, admitting they lived better as captives than their families did as free citizens. The shame of this truth cut deeply, but it also forced them to confront the gap between what they had been told and what they now lived. The cumulative effect was quiet, but profound. Men who had once spoken with certainty of victory now spoke with caution, their words edged with doubt. Some began to imagine what the end of war might bring, what stories they would carry home, what changes might linger within them. The questions spread, seeping into their dreams, shaping the way they looked at guards, at women, at the world beyond the wire. One evening, after a broadcast ended, silence filled the barracks once more. The prisoners sat with their thoughts, the echoes of music and laughter still hanging in the air. A man asked softly, "When we return, what will remain in us?" The question drifted unanswered, too heavy to resolve. But in the pause that followed, each man turned inward, weighing what he would carry when the fences finally opened. The silence stretched long until only the sound of wind against the wooden walls remained. And then, far beyond the camp, came another sound, the distant surge of waves against a shore, the ocean waiting like a gray mirror for ships that would one day carry them home. The sound of the ocean lingered in their dreams long before the ships appeared. When at last the day came, they boarded in silence, climbing gangways much like the ones that had carried them into captivity years before. Yet this time, the air was different. No one shouted, no one hurried them with threats. The sea stretched wide and gray, and the ships rose with slow confidence on the swell. The men crowded the decks, staring outward, the wind cold against their faces. Conversations drifted in fragments, rising and falling like the waves themselves. Some spoke of home with eagerness, others with dread. All carried memories they could not set down. The journey across the Atlantic was filled with uneasy talk. Groups of men huddled together, comparing what they had seen, what they had tasted, what they had heard within the fences of America. One man recalled the first hamburger he had held, still warm in its paper. Another spoke of women walking calmly across the compound at sunset. A third remembered jazz pulsing through the barracks, its rhythm too strange to forget. These were not the stories they had expected to bring home from captivity. Each detail contradicted the propaganda they had once repeated with certainty. Some clung stubbornly to denial, insisting that it had all been deception, that the enemy had staged abundance to weaken them. They said the women had been actors, the food temporary, the magazines planted for effect. Yet the longer the voyage continued, the thinner these explanations sounded. Too many had eaten, too many had seen, too many had heard for the experiences to be dismissed as illusion. Silence often followed such protests, the kind of silence that reveals more doubt than agreement. At night, in the narrow quarters of the ship, men lay awake staring at the ceiling, rocked by the waves. One could still taste grease on his lips, though years had passed since that first bite. Another could still hear laughter, faint and unforced, carried through the camp yard. A third could recall the smell of perfume, light but unmistakable, drifting through the barracks like a memory of another world. These details clung as tightly as salt to the skin, impossible to wash away. Historians later collected memoirs and testimonies from these men, and in them the same patterns emerged. Many admitted their astonishment at the humane treatment they had received, the abundance of food, the presence of women in public life. Some confessed that their beliefs had been shaken, that they returned with doubts they could never fully silence. Others spoke of guilt, of eating well while their families starved, of seeing freedom where they had expected decay. Still others refused to yield, repeating the lines of propaganda even when they no longer fit the shape of memory. The ocean voyage amplified these contradictions. The men had nothing to do but think, to talk, to remember. Days stretched into weeks, the horizon unchanging, the waves endless. In that monotony, the images of captivity replayed themselves with sharper clarity. Some tried to laugh them off, mocking the hamburgers or the music. Others grew quiet, staring out at the sea as though hoping the waves might wash the memories clean. But the memories held, stubborn as the tide. One man described years later how he leaned against the railing at dusk, staring at the expanse of water. He could smell salt, could hear gulls in the distance, could feel the spray on his face. Yet beneath those sensations another remained, as if woven into his very senses, the taste of mustard on a hamburger, tangy and sharp, refusing to fade. He realized then that no amount of denial could erase what he had experienced. The truth of America had entered him not through arguments, but through food, scent, sound, and sight. It had entered quietly, persistently, in ways propaganda could not defend against. The ships pressed onward, their engines humming steadily, carrying the men toward a homeland scarred by bombings and shortages. The thought of return filled many with unease. They wondered how they could describe what they had seen without being accused of betrayal. They wondered whether their families would believe them if they spoke of women in factories, of meals in abundance, of radios filled with laughter. They wondered, too, whether silence might be easier, though silence would never erase what they carried inside. As the coastlines of Europe drew near, conversations grew quieter. Some men rehearsed what they would say, crafting versions of their stories that softened or concealed the details. Others decided to remain silent altogether, keeping their memories folded tightly inside. Yet even as they prepared for return, they could not escape the lingering questions. If the enemy was not what they had been told, then what else in their world had been false? The ocean itself seemed to echo these uncertainties. Its surface shifted endlessly, gray turning to blue, calm to storm, storm to calm again. The men watched the waves, seeing in them the turbulence of their own thoughts. Nothing stayed still. Nothing could be held fixed. On one of the final evenings before landfall, a man stood alone on deck, staring out at the horizon where sea met sky. Around him the ship creaked and groaned. The wind pulled at his coat. He thought of home, of streets rebuilt from rubble, of faces waiting with expectation. He thought of the camp, of laughter and hamburgers, of magazines and perfume. He thought of the contradictions that now filled his mind, and he realized that no return could undo them. They had become part of him, as permanent as the horizon itself. The waves rolled on steady and unyielding, carrying him closer to land. Yet within his mouth lingered a taste he could not forget, a taste that seemed to mock the certainty of every speech he had ever heard. It was the taste of a hamburger, simple and ordinary, yet more powerful than the weapons that had brought him here. The taste lingered long after the ship touched shore, as if memory had lodged itself in the tongue. It was not the richest flavor they had ever known, not the meals of family kitchens or festive tables, but it was unforgettable. Bread soft as clouds, meat pressed into a patty, mustard sharp against the bite, an American hamburger eaten in captivity, carried across the ocean inside them. Even as they stepped onto the gray docks of Europe, as the ruins of cities and the hollow faces of civilians came into view, that taste remained, drifting into memory like smoke that refuses to clear. Return was not triumph, it was dislocation. They found their homeland broken, streets turned to rubble, shortages carved into daily life. Families greeted them with relief, but also with questions. What had they seen? How had they lived? Some spoke cautiously, describing only the essentials, as though too much detail might wound those who had suffered. Others spoke openly, admitting with shame or disbelief that life in captivity had offered more food, more order, even more dignity than life at home. The stories spread unevenly, whispered in taverns, carried in letters, recounted to children who listened wide-eyed. In these stories, the same images returned. The laughter of American women drifting across fences, the smell of hamburgers seeping through wooden walls, the photographs of factories that seemed endless, the music of jazz curling through the barracks at night. Each detail was small, ordinary, almost trivial. Yet together they carried weight greater than guns or tanks. They revealed an enemy that was not the caricature drawn by propaganda, but a society abundant, confident, and resilient. Some refused to accept it. They insisted the abundance had been deception, the women mere actors, the music staged. They held fast to the belief that America was weak, that the old certainties still stood. But even their voices carried strain, for denial is harder when one's own memory contradicts it. Others admitted quietly that their beliefs had been shaken, that what they had witnessed could not be forgotten. They did not always speak of it as admiration, but as confusion, as a lingering question without answer. Historians later noted how these experiences softened perceptions in ways subtle, yet lasting. Former prisoners who settled back into civilian life often carried a strange dual memory of hardship in their homeland and of unexpected abundance in captivity. Some became critical of the systems that had lied to them, questioning the structures of authority they had once trusted without thought. Others built bridges of curiosity, teaching their children that the world beyond Germany was not as monstrous as they had once believed. For many, the memory of American women was among the most vivid. It was not only their presence, but the way they moved with confidence, their laughter unburdened, their roles public and respected. That image haunted men who had grown up in a society that confined women to silence. Some later confessed that it was the sight of women, more than food or music, that truly broke the spell of propaganda. It revealed a freedom that could not be explained away, a freedom embodied not in speeches, but in ordinary gestures. And always there was the food. The hamburger became a symbol, retold in countless variations, sometimes with wonder, sometimes with bitterness. To eat so well while families at home starved created guilt that never faded. Yet the taste also revealed a truth. America's abundance was real, not illusion. A nation that could feed its prisoners with meat and bread, that could let laughter and perfume drift even into camps, was a nation strong in ways they had never been taught to imagine. Years passed, and memories blurred, but certain details remained sharp. The scent of coffee in tin mugs, the turning of magazine pages beneath lantern light, the scratch of jazz through static, the silhouettes of women at sunset. These were the fragments that survivors carried with them, fragments that returned in dreams, in conversations, in the silence of reflection. They were not memories of battle, nor of weapons, nor of uniforms. They were memories of ordinary life, ordinary moments that had unsettled beliefs more deeply than any defeat on the field. In time, some former prisoners returned to America, drawn by curiosity or opportunity. They sought out the places they had once glimpsed through fences, walked streets they had imagined from magazines, even tasted hamburgers again, this time as free men. For them, the past folded into the present, the memory of captivity blending with the discovery of a land that was no longer enemy, but possibility. Yet even for those who never returned, the impact endured. They told their children that the enemy was not always what leaders said it was. They spoke of how ordinary details, a woman's laughter, a song on the radio, a meal on a tray, could reveal truths hidden behind slogans. They warned that certainty could be dangerous, that one must always look with one's own eyes, listen with one's own ears, taste with one's own mouth. And so the story of captivity became more than a story of defeat. It became a story of discovery, of propaganda undone not by speeches, but by simple encounters. A story of men who entered camps certain of their enemy's weakness and left uncertain of everything but the power of ordinary life. As years passed and the war faded into history, these stories drifted into archives, into interviews, into quiet recollections shared before sleep. Yet the essence remained, that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not forged in steel, but in kitchens, in music, in laughter, that a hamburger on a tray, a woman's confident step, a radio playing jazz can shake convictions more deeply than a battlefield's roar. The memory closes with an image unresolved, a man standing at the edge of his homeland, gray waves rolling at his feet, the air heavy with salt. He closes his eyes, and on his tongue, he still tastes that simple hamburger, warm and ordinary, a taste that has outlasted propaganda, outlasted defeat, outlasted even time itself.